This book was generated using Speakter's AI voices. You can create human-like voiceovers in over 50 languages.
The Norland estate in Sussex stood silent, its grand facade a mask of tranquility. Within its walls, however, a storm of grief and uncertainty was brewing. The unexpected death of Mr. Henry Dashwood, the estate's owner, had shattered the peace of the household like a stone through glass. The news of Henry's passing spread through the house with the swiftness of a summer wildfire, leaving in its wake a family consumed by sorrow. In the drawing room, Mrs. Dashwood sat motionless, her eyes fixed on the portrait of her late husband. Her three daughters, Elinor, Marianne, and Margaret, huddled close, their faces pale as the first frost of winter. The air in the room felt thick, heavy with unspoken fears. As the clock ticked relentlessly on the mantelpiece, each second seemed to hammer home the harsh reality of their situation. The Norland estate, with its familiar creaking floorboards and sun-dappled gardens, was slipping through their fingers like sand in an hourglass. On his deathbed, Henry had grasped his son John's hand, his eyes burning with urgency. "Take care of them, John," he had pleaded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your stepmother, your sisters. Promise me you'll provide for them." The words hung in the air, a solemn vow that would soon be tested. In the days that followed, as the family moved through their grief like sleepwalkers, John paced the library. The leather-bound books lining the walls seemed to watch him, silent judges of his internal struggle. Initially, he had considered a substantial sum of $3,000, a lifeline that would have kept his step-family afloat in the choppy waters of their new circumstances. But John's wife, Fanny, was a woman whose heart seemed carved from the very ice that sometimes frosted Norland's windows. Her words, though honeyed, carried a chill that could freeze a summer's day. "Think of our little Harry," she would murmur, her eyes glinting like polished steel. "Surely your father wouldn't have wanted you to impoverish your own son for the sake of others." The pause before others was brief but loaded with disdain. Day by day, Fanny's arguments wore away at John's resolve, like waves eroding a cliff face. From $3,000, the sum dwindled to $1,000, then to a mere $500. Finally, like a castle built on quicksand, John's promise collapsed entirely. "Perhaps," he mused one evening, his voice tinged with forced nonchalance, "occasional gifts would be more appropriate. A brace of pheasants from time to time, or some fine trout from the stream. And of course, we'll help them move when the time comes." Fanny's triumphant smile was hidden behind her teacup, but her eyes glittered with the satisfaction of a cat that had caught a particularly fat mouse. For Mrs. Dashwood and her daughters, the realization of their new reality was like watching storm clouds gather on a once clear horizon. Elinor, the eldest at 19, bore the weight of their changed circumstances with the quiet strength of an oak tree. Her clear eyes took in every detail of their beloved home, committing each nook and cranny to memory. Marianne, passionate and impulsive at 17, railed against the injustice. Her fingers flew over the piano keys in furious arpeggios, the music a tempest of emotion that echoed through Norland's halls. The melodies seemed to give voice to the anguish that words could not express. Margaret, at just 13, watched her older sisters with eyes as wide and worried as a fawn's. Too young to fully comprehend the magnitude of their loss, she nonetheless felt the heavy cloud of despair that had settled over their once happy home like a thick fog. Mrs. Dashwood, her grief for her husband now compounded by the cruel treatment from her stepson and his wife, found herself caught in a maelstrom of emotions. The rooms of Norland, once a comfort, now felt like a gilded cage. Each familiar corner a reminder of what they were about to lose. Every rare kindness from John and Fanny felt tainted, like fruit gone sour on the vine. As autumn's golden light gave way to winter's gray chill, Mrs. Dashwood's determination grew like a stubborn weed pushing through concrete. She would not allow her daughters to wither in this house of fading dreams and broken promises. With renewed purpose, she began to search for a new home, poring over letters and advertisements by candlelight long after her daughters had retired for the night. "We will leave Norland," she declared one morning, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "We will find a place where we can build a new life, away from the shadows of what might have been." And so as the first snowflakes of winter began to dust the grounds of Norland like a gentle blanket, Mrs. Dashwood set her sights on the horizon. She was determined to lead her daughters towards a future that, while uncertain, held the promise of new beginnings. As night fell and the house settled into an uneasy silence, Mrs. Dashwood stood at the window of her bedroom. The moonlight cast long shadows across the lawn, and in the distance she could see the faint outline of the road that would lead them away from Norland. Her heart constricted with a pain so sharp it took her breath away. How could she leave the only home her daughters had ever known? And yet, how could they stay? As she turned from the window, a single tear traced its way down her cheek, a harbinger of the storm of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. Mrs. Dashwood's heart ached with the pain of recent events. The treatment she and her daughters had received from John and Fanny had left deep wounds that seemed impossible to heal. She sat by the window, her eyes scanning the misty horizon, searching for answers that eluded her. The weight of their uncertain future pressed down on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. As if in answer to her silent prayers, a letter arrived. The crisp envelope crackled as she opened it with trembling fingers, her breath catching in her throat. It was from her cousin, Sir John Middleton, offering them a small cottage on his estate in Devonshire. The paper quivered in her hands as she read, hope and trepidation battling within her. The cottage was a far cry from the grandeur of Norland Park, but beggars couldn't be choosers. Mrs. Dashwood's practical side warred with her pride, each vying for dominance in her mind. In the end, necessity won out. With a mixture of relief and apprehension, she penned her acceptance, the scratch of her quill on paper sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet room. The day of departure arrived all too soon, bringing with it a whirlwind of emotions. The Dashwood women stood in the grand entrance hall of Norland, their childhood home, for the last time. The air was thick with unspoken goodbyes and stifled sobs. Elinor, ever the pillar of strength, kept her emotions in check, but her eyes betrayed a glimmer of unshed tears. Marianne, on the other hand, made no attempt to hide her sorrow, her sobs echoing through the empty rooms like a mournful melody. Young Margaret clung to her mother's skirts, her face a mixture of confusion and excitement, too young to fully grasp the gravity of the situation. As their carriage pulled away, the familiar landscape of Norland faded into the distance like a beautiful dream slipping away. The rhythmic clop of horses' hooves seemed to mock them, a constant reminder of the miles stretching between their past and future. The journey to Devonshire was long and tiring, each bump in the road jarring their already fragile spirits. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they arrived at Barton Cottage. The small, weathered building stood before them, a stark contrast to the opulent mansion they had left behind. Yet there was a certain charm to its rustic appearance, nestled as it was in the rolling countryside with the sea visible in the distance. The salty tang of the air filled their lungs, a reminder of new beginnings. Their arrival did not go unnoticed. Sir John Middleton, a jovial man in his 40s, with a booming laugh and twinkling eyes, bounded down the path to greet them. His enthusiasm was infectious, momentarily lifting the spirits of the weary travelers. Behind him came Lady Middleton, a vision of quiet elegance, her reserved demeanor a stark contrast to her husband's exuberance. Completing the welcoming party was Mrs. Jennings, Sir John's mother-in-law. A plump, cheerful widow with a penchant for gossip, she immediately took the Dashwood women under her wing, chattering away about local news and neighbors. Her words washed over them like a warm breeze, offering a strange comfort in their unfamiliar surroundings. As they settled into their new home, each family member found their own way to cope with the change. Elinor, practical and level-headed, threw herself into the task of managing their reduced household budget. She pored over account books late into the night, the flickering candlelight casting shadows on her furrowed brow as she stretched every penny. Marianne sought solace in nature. The picturesque landscape became her sanctuary, and she spent hours wandering the hills and valleys, her soul finding peace in the wild beauty of Devonshire. Often she would return with cheeks flushed and eyes bright, clutching wildflowers or interesting pebbles she had discovered, her heart momentarily lightened by the simple joys of the countryside. Margaret, at 13, adapted with the resilience of youth. The rural setting became her playground, and she delighted in exploring every nook and cranny of their new surroundings. Her laughter, ringing out as she chased butterflies or climbed trees, was a balm to her mother's worried heart, a reminder that joy could still be found in their changed circumstances. The kindness of their new neighbors was a silver lining in their altered life. Sir John, in particular, took it upon himself to introduce them to local society. Invitations to dine at Barton Park, his grand estate, became a regular occurrence. These visits were a mixed blessing. While the Dashwoods appreciated the hospitality, they couldn't help but feel the stark contrast between their small cottage and the grandeur of Barton Park. Each visit was a bittersweet reminder of what they had lost. As the days turned into weeks, the family began to adjust to their new life. The cottage, initially feeling cramped and unfamiliar, slowly began to feel like home. They learned to navigate its quirks: the creaky floorboard in the hallway that announced midnight wanderings, the temperamental kitchen stove that required a gentle touch, the way the sea breeze whistled through a gap in the bedroom window, singing them to sleep each night. Yet even as they settled in, there remained an undercurrent of melancholy. On quiet evenings, when the wind carried the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore, the Dashwood women would sometimes find themselves lost in memories of Norland. The sting of their reduced circumstances was particularly sharp in these moments, as they compared their small cottage to the grandeur of Barton Park. But they held on to hope, for in this new chapter of their lives, anything seemed possible. As the sun set on another day in their new home, Elinor found herself alone by the window, her thoughts drifting to a face she had left behind at Norland. Edward Ferrars, Fanny's brother, had visited them before their departure, and his kind eyes and gentle manner had left an indelible mark on her heart. She wondered if she would ever see him again, if the spark she had felt between them would have a chance to grow into something more. Little did she know that fate had plans that would soon bring Edward back into her life, setting in motion a series of events that would test her heart and her resolve in ways she could never have imagined. Elinor Dashwood's heart had been captured by Edward Ferrars before she left Norland. The brother of Fanny had visited the Dashwood family, leaving an unforgettable impression on Elinor. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke as Elinor walked the grounds of Barton Cottage. Her thoughts, like the swirling mist that clung to the nearby hills, were filled with memories of Edward. Unlike his proud and ambitious sister, Edward possessed a quiet demeanor that spoke volumes. His gentle nature and keen intelligence were a balm to Elinor's practical mind, soothing the rough edges of her new circumstances. In Edward's company, Elinor had found a kindred spirit. Their conversations flowed like a meandering stream, touching on various topics with ease and depth. She could almost hear his voice now, discussing the latest novel they'd both read, his eyes lighting up with enthusiasm. The memory brought a small smile to her lips, quickly followed by a twinge of uncertainty. Elinor's cautious nature held her emotions in check. She was like a butterfly, beautiful in flight, but careful not to be caught in the net of premature hopes. The obstacles looming before them, his family's lofty expectations and their own financial disparities, were ever present in her mind, casting long shadows over her budding feelings. When Edward visited the Dashwoods at Barton Cottage, the air seemed to crackle with unspoken emotions. For a week he stayed, and each day was a delicate dance of affection and restraint. Elinor observed him closely, noting the flickers of warmth in his eyes, but also the occasional cloud of melancholy that passed over his features. She attributed this to his reserved nature, like a book not yet ready to reveal all its secrets. Their walks together were a tapestry of shared moments. The crunch of leaves beneath their feet, the gentle rustle of wind through the trees, all seemed to whisper of possibilities. They discussed books with fervor, their words painting vivid pictures of far-off lands and complex characters. In these moments, Elinor felt a connection so strong it was almost tangible. Yet Edward's lips remained sealed on the matter of his heart. "What do you think of Mr. Bennet's decision in Pride and Prejudice?" Edward asked one afternoon, his breath visible in the cool air. Elinor considered for a moment. "I believe he acted out of love for his daughters, though perhaps not always wisely." Edward nodded, a shadow passing over his face. "Love can lead us to make choices that aren't always understood by others." His words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Elinor's heart quickened, but she kept her composure, unwilling to read too much into his cryptic statement. Unbeknownst to Elinor, Edward grappled with a secret that gnawed at him like a persistent ache. This hidden burden cast a shadow over his joy, making him appear distant at times. It was as if he stood on the edge of a cliff, torn between the desire to leap and the fear of falling. Mrs. Dashwood and Marianne watched the pair with eager eyes, their imaginations racing ahead to wedding bells and happily ever afters. In hushed tones, they spun dreams of Edward and Elinor managing Norland for John, their lives intertwined in both love and duty. "Oh, Mama, can't you see how perfect they are for each other?" Marianne sighed one evening, her romantic heart full of hope. But Elinor, ever the voice of reason, stood firm against the tide of unfounded hopes. Her composure was like a sturdy oak, unmoved by the winds of speculation. With gentle words, she reminded her mother and sister of their new circumstances, of the potential storm of disapproval from Edward's family. "We must not get ahead of ourselves," Elinor cautioned, her voice soft but firm. "There are many factors to consider, and we cannot assume to know Edward's heart or his family's wishes." Her caution was not born of pessimism, but of a deep understanding of the complexities of their situation. Each night, as the cottage settled into slumber, Elinor allowed herself a small sigh, a brief acknowledgement of the feelings she held so carefully in check. As Edward's visit drew to a close, the air grew heavy with unspoken words and unfulfilled possibilities. On his last evening at Barton Cottage, Edward and Elinor stood together in the garden, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky blazed with oranges and pinks, a final burst of color before the encroaching darkness. "Elinor," Edward began, his voice thick with emotion. But before he could finish, a clap of thunder rolled across the sky. The afternoon sky hung heavy with rain clouds. A gloomy pall was cast over the countryside, setting the stage for an unexpected encounter. The afternoon sky hung heavy with rain clouds. A gloomy pall was cast over the countryside, setting the stage for an unexpected encounter. Marianne, a young woman with a heart full of romantic notions, stood at the threshold of Barton Cottage. She inhaled deeply, savoring the earthy scent of impending rain. Despite the threatening weather, an irresistible urge to wander pulled at her soul. With a determined step, she ventured out. The damp air clung to her skin like a lover's caress, and the mist swirled around her feet, as if nature itself conspired to create the perfect backdrop for her poetic musings. Each step took her further from the safety of home and deeper into her own thoughts. The gentle patter of raindrops soon crescendoed into a steady rhythm. Marianne found herself facing a steep, grassy hill. Her heart quickened, not with fear, but with the thrill of adventure. She began her descent, her fingers trailing through the wet blades of grass. Suddenly the world tilted. The slick grass betrayed her footing, and Marianne felt herself falling. Time seemed to slow as she tumbled down the slope, a cry escaping her lips. She came to rest at the bottom, pain shooting through her ankle. As if summoned by her distress, a figure emerged from the misty veil. Atop a magnificent steed sat John Willoughby, his eyes sparkling with vitality even in the gloomy light. He reined in his horse, concern etched across his handsome features. "My God, are you hurt?" His rich voice cut through the sound of falling rain. Marianne, stunned by both her fall and the appearance of this dashing stranger, could only nod mutely. Willoughby dismounted in one fluid motion, his boots squelching in the mud as he rushed to her side. Without hesitation, he scooped her into his arms. Marianne's breath caught in her throat, not from pain, but from the sudden proximity to this handsome rescuer. His scent, an intoxicating mix of leather and rain, enveloped her. "Allow me to escort you home," he said, his breath warm against her cheek. As they made their way back to the cottage, Marianne's heart raced. She was acutely aware of Willoughby's strong arms supporting her, the way his eyes kept darting to her face with genuine concern. It was as if every romantic novel she had ever read had come to life in this moment. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotion for Marianne. Willoughby became a frequent visitor to the cottage, each arrival heralded by thoughtful gifts, a bouquet of wildflowers or a book of poetry. Their conversations flowed effortlessly, touching on shared passions for literature, music, and the ideals of love. One golden afternoon, Marianne found herself at the pianoforte, her fingers dancing across the keys as her voice lifted in song. Willoughby joined her, their voices blending in perfect harmony. As the last notes faded, their eyes met, and Marianne felt as if her very soul was laid bare before him. Their walks in the countryside became a daily ritual, each step bringing them closer together. Willoughby's wit and charm matched Marianne's passionate nature perfectly. He encouraged her to embrace her feelings, to live life with the intensity of a flame. "Why should we restrain ourselves?" he asked as they stood atop a hill, the wind whipping around them. "Life is too short for prudence and caution." Marianne's heart soared at his words. She felt as if she had finally found someone who truly understood her, who saw the world through the same rose-tinted glasses she wore. As the days turned to weeks, Marianne's affection for Willoughby grew deeper and more intense. In a moment of romantic fervor, she presented him with a lock of her hair, tied with a ribbon. The gesture, laden with significance, seemed to seal their connection. Mrs. Dashwood watched the blossoming romance with maternal approval, seeing in Willoughby the perfect match for her passionate daughter. Even Elinor, usually so cautious and reserved, found herself warming to the charming young man, though she gently cautioned Marianne about guarding her heart. "Remember, dear sister," Elinor said one evening as they prepared for bed, "that not all that glitters is gold." But Marianne, caught up in the whirlwind of her emotions, paid little heed to such warnings. Her world had become Willoughby, and she saw no reason to temper her feelings. As summer deepened, so did the intrigue surrounding Willoughby. Sir John Middleton, ever the source of local gossip, revealed tantalizing details about the young man's background. Willoughby, it seemed, was not just a dashing gentleman, but the heir to the nearby estate of Allenham. Moreover, he stood to inherit a considerable fortune from his elderly relative, Mrs. Smith. This news only served to heighten the air of romance that surrounded Willoughby in Marianne's eyes. He was in every way the hero she had always dreamed of, handsome, passionate, and now destined for greatness. As the sun set on another perfect day, Marianne stood at her window, her heart full to bursting with love and hope. She watched Willoughby's figure disappear down the lane, already longing for his return. Little did she know that as the shadows lengthened, so too did the whispers and knowing glances of their neighbors. Their growing attachment was becoming the talk of the town, and the stage was set for a drama that would test the very foundations of their passionate love. Marianne and Willoughby's relationship blossomed like a spring flower, captivating all who witnessed it. Their growing attachment became the talk of the neighborhood, spreading through whispered conversations and knowing glances. The warm summer air buzzed with excitement as the young couple strolled arm in arm through the lush gardens of Barton Park. Willoughby's dark curls danced in the gentle breeze, his eyes never straying far from Marianne's radiant face. Her laughter, like the tinkling of silver bells, echoed across the manicured lawns, drawing smiles from even the most stoic onlookers. Sir John Middleton and Mrs. Jennings, the mischievous matchmakers of the county, couldn't resist their good-natured teasing. My, what a handsome pair you make," Mrs. Jennings would exclaim, her eyes twinkling with delight. Marianne's cheeks would flush a delicate pink, while Willoughby's hand would find its way to the small of her back, a gesture both protective and possessive. Amidst this whirlwind romance, Colonel Brandon stood apart, a solitary figure of quiet dignity. And at 35, he was a man out of time in this youthful gathering. His eyes, filled with a mixture of admiration and concern, followed Marianne's every move. But to her, Brandon might as well have been invisible, his reserved manner and older age rendering him as unsuitable for romance as a well-worn book left forgotten on a dusty shelf. The lazy days of summer rolled on, each one filled with new delights. Picnics under ancient oak trees, their branches spreading wide to provide a natural canopy. Long walks through sun-dappled woods where Willoughby would pluck wildflowers to weave into Marianne's hair. Every moment seemed to shimmer with the golden hue of young love. One particularly bright morning, the air thick with the sweet scent of blooming roses, the Dashwoods and their friends gathered for a planned excursion to Whitwell. The estate, belonging to Colonel Brandon's brother-in-law, promised new adventures and sights to behold. Excitement bubbled through the group like champagne, faces alight with anticipation. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. As the group bustled about, readying themselves for the day ahead, a servant appeared with a letter for Willoughby. The crisp, white envelope seemed to carry with it a chill that cut through the warm summer air. Willoughby's face, usually so open and cheerful, clouded over as he read its contents, his brow furrowing with each line. With a suddenness that left everyone reeling, Willoughby announced his immediate departure for London. "Urgent business for my aunt, Mrs. Smith," he explained, his words clipped and his eyes avoiding Marianne's questioning gaze. The group fell into a stunned silence, the excitement of the day evaporating like morning dew on grass. Willoughby's farewell was a whirlwind of activity, but his goodbye to Marianne stood out like a moment frozen in time. Their hands clasped, fingers intertwining as if they could hold on to this moment forever. Their eyes locked in a silent conversation that spoke volumes, conveying promises and fears that words could not express. As he rode away, the dust kicked up by his horse's hooves seemed to obscure more than just the road. It blurred the certainty of his return, leaving no clear promise of when they would meet again. The cancellation of the Whitwell excursion felt like salt in an open wound, compounding the general disappointment that hung in the air like a heavy fog. Marianne, once so vibrant and full of life, withered like a flower cut from its stem. Her days became a monotonous blur of waiting for letters that never came, for a familiar silhouette on the horizon that never materialized. The pianoforte, once a source of joy, became Marianne's confidant in sorrow. Her fingers coaxed melancholy melodies from the keys, each note a testament to her broken heart. The contrast between Marianne's open display of emotion and Elinor's quiet suffering over Edward's absence was stark. Like the difference between a raging storm and a still, deep pool. Colonel Brandon, ever observant, watched Marianne's distress with growing concern. His brow furrowed with worry, and occasionally a shadow would pass over his face, as if he carried a secret too heavy to share. He hinted at some knowledge of Willoughby's character, his words cryptic and laden with unspoken warnings, adding an air of mystery to Willoughby's sudden departure. Sir John and Mrs. Jennings, in their well-meaning way, attempted to lift Marianne's spirits with their usual jovial banter, but their efforts were like trying to warm a winter's day with a candle. Ineffective, and to Marianne, increasingly irritating. Their laughter and light-hearted jokes grated against her raw emotions, each attempt at cheer driving her further into herself. As weeks stretched into an eternity of waiting, worry began to seep into the hearts of Marianne's family. The true nature of Willoughby's feelings and intentions towards Marianne became a topic of hushed conversations and concerned glances. The once certain future now seemed as unpredictable as the changing winds, leaving them all adrift in a sea of uncertainty. Just as the weight of Willoughby's absence threatened to crush Marianne's spirit entirely, a glimmer of hope appeared on the horizon. Mrs. Jennings, her face alight with excitement, bustled into the drawing room one afternoon. "My dears," she exclaimed, her eyes twinkling with mischief, "I have the most wonderful news." Marianne's heart leapt, daring to hope. Could it be news of Willoughby? As Mrs. Jennings opened her mouth to continue, the air in the room seemed to still, every breath held in anticipation of what was to come. Mrs. Jennings extended a gracious invitation to Elinor and Marianne. She asked them to join her in London for the winter season, a prospect that filled the sisters with a whirlwind of emotions. Marianne's eyes sparkled like stars on a clear night, her heart racing with the rhythm of galloping horses. The mere thought of seeing Willoughby again sent shivers down her spine. "Yes, of course," she exclaimed, her voice trembling with barely contained joy. Elinor, ever the pragmatist, agreed with a polite smile that masked her inner turmoil. Her mind whirred like a well-oiled machine, calculating the potential pitfalls of such a journey. The carriage rattled over London's cobblestone streets, each jolt a reminder of how far they'd come from their quiet country life. The city's cacophony of sounds assaulted their senses. The clip-clop of horses' hooves, the shouts of street vendors, the constant hum of 1,000 conversations. Mrs. Jennings's house on Berkeley Street loomed before them, a towering giant of brick and mortar that seemed to touch the very sky. No sooner had they crossed the threshold than Marianne flew to her writing desk. Her quill danced across the paper, leaving trails of ink like breadcrumbs leading to her heart. Each word pulsed with anticipation as she informed Willoughby of her arrival. Days crawled by like snails, leaving silvery trails of disappointment. Marianne haunted the windows, her breath fogging the glass as she scanned the bustling street below. Every passing carriage made her heart leap, only to plummet when it wasn't him. Elinor watched her sister's growing distress with a heavy heart, feeling as helpless as a bird with clipped wings. At last, a social gathering brought the long-awaited encounter. The ballroom hummed with life, a hive of silk-clad bees buzzing with gossip and laughter. For Marianne, it all faded to a dull roar when she spotted Willoughby. Her face lit up like a lantern in the dark, but as she approached him, that light dimmed, replaced by a shadow of confusion and hurt. Willoughby's demeanor was as cold as a winter frost, his eyes skittering away from hers like frightened mice, his words clipped and formal. Marianne's world tilted on its axis, leaving her stumbling through the rest of the evening in a daze. Her mind was a tumult of questions and fears, each thought crashing against the next like waves in a storm. That night she poured her heart out onto paper, her tears mingling with the ink as she demanded an explanation from the man she thought loved her. Willoughby's reply came swiftly, but it brought no comfort. The letter was brief and impersonal, a stranger's words on familiar paper. Accompanying it were the returned tokens of their affection, her letters and a lock of her hair. Each word was a dagger to Marianne's heart, each familiar object a reminder of shattered dreams. The final blow came with the news of Willoughby's engagement to Miss Grey, a wealthy heiress. The announcement spread through London like wildfire, its flames licking at the sisters' ears with cruel swiftness. Marianne collapsed under the weight of her grief, her sobs echoing through the house like a mournful melody. Elinor, ever the pillar of strength, tended to her sister while battling her own disappointment. Edward Ferrars, the man who held her affections, remained conspicuously absent despite knowing of their presence in London. His silence spoke volumes, adding to the sisters' growing disillusionment with matters of the heart. Mrs. Jennings, determined to lift their spirits, introduced them to a whirlwind of social engagements. They met her other daughter, Charlotte Palmer, whose cheerful chatter bubbled like a brook, providing a stark contrast to her husband's sardonic remarks. Mr. Palmer's biting wit often left an uncomfortable silence in its wake, like a sudden frost killing spring blossoms. It was at one of these gatherings that they encountered the Steele sisters, Lucy and Anne. Lucy, with her pretty face and calculating eyes, took an immediate interest in Elinor. Her friendship felt like a spider's web, intricate, sticky, and potentially dangerous. Amidst the social chaos, Colonel Brandon emerged as a steady presence, like a lighthouse in a storm. His concern for Marianne was evident in every gentle inquiry, every compassionate glance. One evening he pulled Elinor aside, his face grave as he revealed his shocking truth about Willoughby's past. The story of Eliza Williams, Brandon's young ward seduced and abandoned by Willoughby, cast a dark shadow over the charming facade Willoughby had presented to the world. As Elinor absorbed this information, she felt as though she were seeing Willoughby clearly for the first time. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place, revealing a picture far uglier than she had imagined. Her heart ached for Marianne, knowing the pain this revelation would cause if she ever learned of it. The London season continued, a glittering carousel of parties and social calls. But for Elinor and Marianne, it had become a crucible, testing their resilience and forcing them to confront painful truths about love and human nature. Each day brought new challenges, new revelations, and new wounds to heal. As they navigated this unfamiliar terrain, the sisters clung to each other, their bond strengthening even as their illusions crumbled around them. As the chapter drew to a close, Marianne lay in her bed, staring blankly at the ceiling. The weight of her heartbreak pressed down on her chest, making each breath a struggle. Elinor, watching from the doorway, felt a chill of foreboding. Little did she know that this was just the beginning of Marianne's descent into a darkness deeper than anything they had yet faced. Marianne's heart lay in ruins, shattered by the cruel realities of London society. The weight of her despair crushed her spirit, plunging her into a deep, all-consuming depression. The once vibrant young woman now drifted through the house like a specter, her eyes red-rimmed and distant. Days blurred into nights as she retreated into her own world of sorrow. The tick of the grandfather clock in the hall seemed to mock her, each second a reminder of her pain. Meals became a battle. Marianne's trembling hands pushed away plates laden with food, as if sustenance itself had become an enemy. The clatter of silverware against china echoed her inner turmoil. Social engagements, once a source of excitement, now felt like a noose tightening around her neck. When invited, she would shake her head silently, fleeing to the sanctuary of her room. There, hunched over her writing desk, Marianne would spend hours penning letters to Willoughby. The scratch of her quill against parchment was a constant companion, each word a desperate plea for understanding. But as the pile of unsent letters grew, so did her despair. Elinor watched her sister's decline with growing alarm. Marianne's cheeks, once rosy with life, had grown pale and hollow. Her gowns hung loosely on her frame, a stark reminder of how much weight she'd lost. The rustle of fabric as Marianne moved seemed too loud in the hushed atmosphere of worry that permeated the house. Mrs. Jennings, usually jovial and boisterous, now spoke in hushed tones with Elinor, her brow furrowed with concern. The absence of her usual laughter left a void in the house, as if even the walls could sense the change in their occupants. In this time of darkness, an unexpected source of support emerged. Colonel Brandon, steady as an oak in a storm, became a frequent visitor. His quiet presence seemed to bring a measure of calm to the household. The sound of his measured footsteps on the gravel path outside became a source of comfort for Elinor. One afternoon, as Marianne lay curled up on a window seat, staring unseeing at the bustling London street below, Brandon drew Elinor aside. The muffled sounds of carriages and street vendors drifted through the glass, a stark contrast to the heavy silence within. In the privacy of the drawing room, Brandon's usually stoic demeanor cracked. He spoke of his past, his voice low and tinged with old pain. The ticking of the mantel clock seemed to slow as he told Elinor of his first love, another Eliza, forced into a loveless marriage with his older brother. Brandon's eyes grew distant as he described her tragic fate, abandoned, impoverished, and ultimately claimed by an early death. As he spoke, the pieces of his character fell into place for Elinor. His concern for Marianne, his protective nature, it all stemmed from this buried heartache. The weight of his words hung in the air, as tangible as the dust motes dancing in the afternoon sunlight. As winter's chill gave way to spring's tentative warmth, preparations began for the Dashwood sisters' return home. The house buzzed with activity as trunks were packed and farewells exchanged with their London acquaintances. But before returning to Barton Cottage, they were to break their journey at Cleveland, the Palmers' estate. The change of scenery did little to lift Marianne's spirits. If anything, the sprawling grounds of Cleveland seemed to fuel her melancholy. She took to wandering the estate's paths alone, heedless of the damp weather that clung to her clothes and chilled her to the bone. The squelch of mud beneath her feet and the rustle of wind through bare branches became the soundtrack to her sorrow. It was on one such walk that disaster struck. Marianne stumbled back to the house, her face flushed and her eyes glassy with fever. Within hours she was confined to bed, her body racked with chills one moment and burning with heat the next. The crackle of the fire in her sick room was punctuated by her labored breathing and occasional whimpers of discomfort. Elinor's world narrowed to her sister's sick room. She bathed Marianne's forehead with cool cloths, coaxed sips of broth past her parched lips, and whispered words of comfort when delirium took hold. The scent of medicinal herbs hung heavy in the air, mingling with the acrid smell of sweat and sickness. Colonel Brandon proved invaluable during this crisis. He rode through the night to fetch Mrs. Dashwood, the pounding of his horse's hooves echoing the frantic beating of his heart. The urgency of his mission was written in every line of his face as he galloped through the darkness. As Marianne hovered between life and death, an unexpected visitor arrived at Cleveland. Willoughby, his face haggard and his clothes disheveled, burst into the house demanding to see Elinor. The slam of the front door and the sound of his hurried footsteps on the stairs sent a jolt of surprise through the household. In a flood of words, he poured out his confession. He spoke of his genuine love for Marianne, of the crushing weight of his debts, and of the scandal with Eliza Williams that had forced his hand into a loveless marriage for money. His eyes, once so charming, now held only regret and self-loathing. The raw emotion in his voice filled the room, as palpable as the tension in the air. Slowly, like the first green shoots after a long winter, Marianne began to recover. As her fever broke and her strength returned, a change came over her. The fire of her passions, once all-consuming, seemed tempered. She spoke less of Willoughby and more of her own behavior, examining her actions with a newfound maturity. In quiet moments, Marianne's gaze would often fall on the Colonel Brandon. She noticed things she had overlooked before, the kindness in his eyes, the steadiness of his presence. As she compared his unwavering support to Willoughby's fleeting passion, Marianne felt the stirrings of a new understanding. Perhaps, she mused, true love was less about grand gestures and more about constancy, about being there in the darkest of times. And as this realization took root, Marianne found herself looking at Colonel Brandon in a new light, the first glimmers of appreciation blossoming in her heart, the soft rustle of his coat as he moved, the gentle timbre of his voice. Details she had once overlooked now seemed to take on new significance. As the Dashwood sisters prepared for their final journey home, a sense of anticipation filled the air. The worst seemed to be behind them, and the promise of a fresh start at Barton Cottage beckoned. Yet even as they packed their trunks and said their goodbyes, a new arrival was making her way to London. Lucy Steele, her heart pounding with a secret that threatened to upend everything, stepped off the carriage onto the bustling London street. Her eyes gleamed with determination as she clutched her valise, unaware of the storm she was about to unleash. Lucy Steele, the younger of the Steele sisters, arrived in London with a secret burning in her chest. The bustling city provided her with an opportunity to confide in Elinor, revealing a truth that would shake the foundations of their social circle. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the drawing room as Lucy and Elinor sat together. The air was thick with the scent of freshly brewed tea and the faint aroma of lavender from the vase on the windowsill. Lucy's fingers fidgeted with the lace trim of her dress, her eyes darting nervously around the room before finally settling on Elinor's face. "Miss Dashwood," Lucy whispered, her voice barely audible above the ticking of the ornate clock on the mantelpiece. "I have been secretly engaged to Edward Ferrars for 4 years." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, suffocating and oppressive. Elinor felt as though the ground had opened beneath her feet, threatening to swallow her whole. Her heart, once full of tender hopes for Edward, now seemed to constrict painfully in her chest. Yet her face remained a mask of calm, a porcelain facade that betrayed nothing of the turmoil raging within. Lucy, perhaps sensing a rival in Elinor, began to share intimate details of her engagement with an almost cruel enthusiasm. Her words painted vivid pictures of stolen moments and secret promises. She spoke of a ring Edward had given her, containing a lock of his hair, a physical token of their bond. As Lucy's story unfolded, Elinor's mind raced, piecing together fragments of memories like a shattered mirror. Edward's occasional melancholy, his hesitancy in certain moments. The puzzle of his character was coming together in a way she had never anticipated, and the image it revealed was both familiar and painfully foreign. The days that followed were a delicate dance of secrets and unspoken truths. Elinor moved through London's social scenes like a ghost, present in body, but her mind constantly pulled back to the weight of her knowledge. The city's noise and bustle seemed muffled, as though she were viewing the world through a veil of grief. The clatter of carriages on cobblestone streets, the chatter of passers-by, all faded into a dull roar that couldn't penetrate the fog of her thoughts. It was during a visit to John and Fanny Dashwood's home that the carefully constructed facade began to crumble. The drawing room was a picture of refined elegance, with its silk damask curtains and gleaming mahogany furniture. The air was heavy with the scent of beeswax polish and expensive perfume. Anne Steele, Lucy's older sister, whose tongue was looser than her discretion, let slip the secret of the engagement. The revelation fell like a thunderbolt in the quiet room. Fanny Dashwood's face contorted with shock and outrage, her complexion turning from pale to crimson in a matter of seconds. Her shrill voice cut through the air like a knife as she ordered the Steele sisters from her house, her words sharp and cutting. The room erupted into chaos, with gasps of shock and hurried whispers filling the air. As the dust settled from this explosive revelation, Elinor found herself at the eye of the storm. The secret she had guarded so carefully was now out in the open, setting off a chain reaction that would ripple through their entire social circle. Yet even in this moment of chaos, Elinor's strength shone through like a beacon in the darkness. She confided in only one person, Colonel Brandon. In the quiet of a secluded garden, away from prying eyes and gossiping tongues, Elinor allowed herself a moment of vulnerability. The gentle rustling of leaves and the soft chirping of birds provided a soothing backdrop to her confession. Her words, carefully chosen and softly spoken, revealed the depth of her heartache to the colonel, who listened with a compassion that spoke of his own experiences with unrequited love. As the London visit drew to a close, Elinor stood at the precipice of an uncertain future. The revelation of Lucy's engagement had created a complex web of emotions and loyalties, testing Elinor's strength and resolve in ways she had never imagined. Yet, like a tree bending in a storm, she remained rooted, her inner fortitude a quiet but unshakable force in the face of heartbreak and upheaval. Little did Elinor know that the ripples of this revelation were about to turn into a tidal wave. As she prepared to leave London, a whisper caught her ear, a fragment of conversation that made her blood run cold. The news of Edward's secret engagement was spreading, and it was only a matter of time before it reached the ears of his family. The storm that was brewing threatened to tear apart not just her world, but Edward's as well. With a heavy heart and a mind full of uncertainty, Elinor stepped into her carriage, leaving behind the city that had changed everything. The news of Edward's secret engagement to Lucy Steele spread rapidly through the countryside. It wasn't long before the whispers reached the ears of his family, igniting a firestorm that would alter the course of many lives. The air in Mrs. Ferrars's opulent drawing room crackled with tension. Sunlight filtered through heavy curtains, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Mrs. Ferrars sat rigid in her high-backed chair, her face a mask of barely contained fury. Her fingers, adorned with glittering rings, trembled as she gripped the armrests. "Edward," she hissed, her voice as sharp as a blade, "you will break off this ridiculous engagement at once." Edward stood before her, his spine straight and his gaze unwavering. The ticking of the ornate clock on the mantelpiece seemed to grow louder in the silence that followed. "I cannot, Mother," he said quietly, his words carrying the weight of his conviction. "I have given my word, and I intend to honor it." Mrs. Ferrars's eyes flashed dangerously. In one swift motion, she rose from her seat, her silk gown rustling like angry whispers. "Then you leave me no choice," she declared, her voice rising. "You are cut off. Not a single penny will you see from this family's fortune." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Edward felt the ground shift beneath his feet, but he remained steady. As he turned to leave, the sunlight caught his profile, illuminating a mixture of pain and resolve etched on his features. Miles away, in the cozy confines of the Dashwood cottage, Elinor sat by the window, her needlework forgotten in her lap. The gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming roses, a stark contrast to the turmoil in her heart. As she gazed out at the rolling hills, her mind replayed the moments she had shared with Edward, each memory now tinged with a bittersweet ache. The sound of approaching footsteps broke her reverie. Marianne burst into the room, her cheeks flushed and her eyes wide with excitement. "Elinor," she exclaimed, breathless, "you'll never believe what I've just heard." Elinor braced herself, her heart quickening. As Marianne recounted the tale of Edward's disinheritance, Elinor's composure wavered. A single tear escaped, tracing a path down her cheek like a silent confession of her long-held feelings. The news spread through the household like wildfire. Mrs. Dashwood's voice, filled with motherly concern, mingled with Marianne's passionate exclamations. The cottage buzzed with speculation and worry. But what will become of Edward now? Marianne wondered aloud, pacing the small sitting room. The flames in the hearth danced, casting flickering shadows that seemed to mirror the uncertainty of Edward's fate. Elinor, ever the voice of reason, spoke softly. "He has always expressed a desire to join the clergy. Perhaps now he will pursue that path." As night fell, the Dashwood family gathered around the fire, their faces illuminated by its warm glow. The crackling of the flames punctuated their hushed conversation, as they debated Edward's situation, their words a mixture of admiration for his principles and concern for his future. Elinor sat quietly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The firelight caught the unshed tears in her eyes, making them glimmer like stars. As she listened to her family's discussion, a small spark of hope flickered in her heart, as fragile and persistent as the flames before her. In the days that followed, Edward found himself adrift in a sea of uncertainty. The weight of his decision pressed down on him like a physical force. As he wandered the countryside, the once familiar landscape seemed alien and unwelcoming. The rustling leaves and chirping birds felt like a mockery of his inner turmoil. Yet even in his darkest moments, Edward clung to his principles like a lifeline. The memory of Lucy's face, the weight of his promise, kept him moving forward, one uncertain step at a time. As the sun set on another day, casting long shadows across the land, a messenger arrived at the Dashwood cottage. His presence sent a ripple of anticipation through the household. With trembling hands, Elinor accepted the sealed letter he presented, her heart pounding in her chest. As she broke the seal, the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the news that would once again shake the foundations of their quiet lives. A startling revelation shook the tranquil world of the Dashwood family. News of an astonishing nature reached their quiet household, causing quite a stir. Lucy Steele, it was learned, had not only broken her engagement with Edward, but had also married his brother Robert. The news fell upon the Dashwood women like a sudden summer storm, leaving them stunned and speechless. Elinor sat frozen in her chair, her face a canvas of conflicting emotions, while Marianne's sharp gasp cut through the silence, her hand flying to her mouth. Even Mrs. Dashwood, usually a beacon of calm, found herself at a loss for words. As the initial shock subsided, the family gathered in the drawing room, the air thick with the scent of confusion and wonder. The soft tick of the mantel clock seemed to grow louder in the hushed atmosphere as they began to dissect every detail of this unexpected turn of events. How could Lucy change her affections so swiftly? Marianne wondered aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. The truth, as it emerged, was as cold and calculating as a winter frost. Following Edward's disinheritance, Lucy had turned her gaze to Robert, now the heir to the Ferrars' fortune. With the precision of a master strategist, she had cultivated a relationship with him, her flattery as sweet and intoxicating as honey wine. Elinor's heart raced as she processed this information. The chains of obligation that had bound Edward were now broken, not by his own hand, for he was far too honorable for such an act, but by Lucy's mercenary nature. Hope, long suppressed, began to bloom in her chest like a delicate spring flower, its tendrils reaching out to warm her from within. Marianne, still recuperating from her illness, found her perspective shifting. She gazed out the window, lost in thought, the golden afternoon light casting a warm glow on her pale features. Her mind wandered to Colonel Brandon, his unwavering support during her darkest hours now shining like a beacon of constancy in a sea of change. Mrs. Dashwood observed her daughters with a mother's keen eye, noting the subtle shifts in their demeanor. A small smile played on her lips as she envisioned a future where both her girls might find happiness. The days that followed were filled with a palpable sense of anticipation. Every creak of the gate, every distant hoofbeat set hearts racing. Elinor found herself lost in daydreams, only to chastise herself for such flights of fancy. She dared not hope too much, for fear that reality might prove a cruel mistress. In London, the news of Robert's marriage to Lucy sent shockwaves through the Ferrars family. Mrs. Ferrars and Fanny, who had once rejected Lucy with such vehemence, now found themselves in the uncomfortable position of having to accept her as a daughter-in-law. Their indignation was a storm in a teacup, fierce but ultimately inconsequential. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, the Dashwood family retired to their rooms, each lost in their own thoughts. The unexpected turn of events had shaken their world, leaving them to wonder what further surprises fate might have in store. Elinor stood by her window, her fingers tracing patterns on the cool glass. The soft chirping of evening birds filled the air, a gentle counterpoint to the tumult of her thoughts. She closed her eyes, allowing herself a moment of hope. What if Edward's feelings for her had remained constant? What if this twist of fate had cleared the path for their happiness? Just as she was about to turn away, a movement caught her eye. A lone figure was making its way up the lane, silhouetted against the fading light. Elinor's heart leapt into her throat. Could it be? She leaned forward, straining to make out the features of the approaching visitor. As the figure drew nearer, a familiar gait became apparent, and Elinor's breath caught in her chest. It was Edward. Colonel Brandon stood motionless in the drawing room of Barton Park, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The warm afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor as he contemplated the young man who had captured his respect. The air hung heavy with the scent of polished wood and fresh flowers, a stark contrast to the tumultuous emotions swirling within Brandon's chest. His gaze drifted to the distant hills, their gentle slopes a reminder of the steadfast nature he so admired in Edward Ferrars. Edward's decision to honor his engagement to Lucy Steele, despite the loss of his inheritance and family scorn, had struck a chord deep within Brandon. It was a testament to the young man's character, a quality all too rare in their society of fickle affections and calculated alliances. With a deep breath that seemed to steady the very room around him, Brandon made his way to where Elinor Dashwood sat. The soft rustle of her skirts and the gentle click of her embroidery needle provided a soothing counterpoint to his racing thoughts. "Miss Dashwood," he began, his voice low and earnest, barely audible above the ticking of the mantel clock. "I have a matter of great importance to discuss with you." Elinor looked up, her eyebrows arched in curiosity. The afternoon light caught the glint of her needle, momentarily blinding Brandon as he settled into the chair beside her. He leaned forward, the leather creaking softly beneath him. "I wish to offer Mr. Ferrars the living of Delaford Parsonage," he explained, his eyes alight with purpose. "It's a modest position, worth about £200 a year, but it would provide him with a respectable profession and a home." Elinor's eyes widened, her needle freezing mid-stitch. The silence between them stretched, filled with unspoken emotion. "Colonel," she breathed at last, her voice thick with feeling, "that is incredibly generous of you." A small smile tugged at Brandon's lips, softening the lines of his face. "I believe Mr. Ferrars deserves this opportunity," he said softly. "And I was hoping, Miss Dashwood, that you might convey this offer to him on my behalf. I think he might be more comfortable accepting it through you." Elinor's heart swelled with gratitude and admiration for the colonel. She nodded, setting aside her embroidery with trembling hands. "I would be honored to do so, Colonel Brandon." The next day dawned bright and clear, a gentle breeze carrying the promise of change. Elinor made her way to the small inn where Edward was staying, each step on the gravel path echoing the nervous flutter of her heart. The weathered building loomed before her, its peeling paint and crooked shutters a stark reminder of Edward's reduced circumstances. As she approached, the scent of fresh-baked bread wafted from a nearby window, mingling with the earthy smell of damp soil and wildflowers. Edward's face, when he saw her, was a canvas of emotions: surprise, joy, and a flicker of something deeper that made Elinor's breath catch in her throat. "Miss Dashwood," he exclaimed, rising quickly from his seat by the window. "I didn't expect, that is, I'm very pleased to see you." Elinor smiled, feeling warmth spread across her cheeks. "Mr. Ferrars, I come with news," she said, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. As she relayed Colonel Brandon's offer, she watched Edward's expression transform, confusion giving way to disbelief, and finally to overwhelming gratitude. "I don't know what to say," Edward stammered, his eyes bright with unshed tears. The sunlight streaming through the window caught the moisture, making them sparkle like diamonds. "This is more than I could have ever hoped for." Elinor reached out, briefly touching his arm. The warmth of his skin through the fabric of his coat sent a jolt through her. "You deserve this, Edward," she said softly. "Colonel Brandon recognizes your worth, as do we all." The offer of the living became a turning point, a pebble dropped into still water, its ripples touching all their lives. Edward, now with a respectable profession and income, found himself daring to hope for a future he had thought lost to him. At Barton Cottage, the atmosphere crackled with newfound energy. Marianne, her eyes sparkling with renewed interest, leaned forward in her chair as her mother read aloud Colonel Brandon's letter detailing his generous act. "He truly is a man of great worth and feeling," Marianne mused, her voice tinged with admiration. She found herself drawn to the quiet strength of the colonel, his steady affection a stark contrast to Willoughby's passionate but ultimately shallow love. As the days passed, each one bringing new hope and possibility, Edward made his way to Barton Cottage. The Dashwood family welcomed him warmly, the cozy sitting room a haven of acceptance and understanding. As Edward explained the circumstances of his broken engagement, Elinor felt her love for him grow even stronger. Their eyes met across the room, a world of unspoken feelings passing between them. Mrs. Dashwood observed this exchange with a knowing smile, her maternal heart swelling with joy for her eldest daughter. Meanwhile, Marianne found herself spending more time in Colonel Brandon's company. She listened, rapt, as he shared stories of his travels, his deep voice painting vivid pictures of far-off lands. In turn, she opened up to him about her thoughts on literature and music, finding in him a kindred spirit she had never expected. As the golden light of late afternoon bathed the garden in a warm glow, Marianne sat with Colonel Brandon on a weathered stone bench. The sweet scent of roses hung in the air, mingling with the earthy aroma of freshly turned soil. She turned to him, her eyes alight with newfound understanding. "Colonel," she began, her voice soft but sure, "I believe I'm beginning to see the world, and you, in a whole new light." Brandon's heart quickened at her words, hope blossoming in his chest like the first flowers of spring. As they continued their conversation, delving into shared passions and dreams, the future seemed to unfold before them, rich with possibility. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the garden, a messenger arrived at Barton Cottage. He carried a letter addressed to Edward, the seal bearing the unmistakable crest of the Ferrars family. With trembling hands, Edward broke the seal, his eyes scanning the contents. His face paled, then flushed with color. He looked up, his gaze meeting Elinor's across the room. "It seems," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "that my circumstances have changed once again." Edward's engagement to Lucy was no more, freeing him from the shackles of obligation. With this newfound liberty came the promise of a stable income, igniting a spark of hope in his heart. The world seemed brighter, more vibrant, as if a veil had been lifted from his eyes. With each step towards Barton Cottage, his pulse quickened, matching the rhythm of his anticipation. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the path, painting the countryside in hues of gold and amber. Edward's boots crunched on the gravel, the sound echoing his nervous heartbeat. The familiar sight of the ivy-covered walls came into view, both comforting and daunting. He paused, taking a deep breath of the crisp air, laden with the scent of blooming wildflowers and freshly cut grass. As he raised his hand to knock, a tremor ran through him. The door creaked open, revealing Elinor's surprised face. Time seemed to stand still, the air between them charged with unspoken emotions. Then, like a dam bursting, words began to flow, carrying years of pent-up feelings. "Elinor," Edward began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I must explain." His words tumbled out, painting a picture of youthful naivety and misplaced honor. As he spoke, Elinor's eyes softened, understanding dawning in their depths. "I was bound by duty," he continued, his voice gaining strength. "But my heart has always been yours." Elinor listened, her chest tight with emotion. She could see the torment etched in the lines of his face, the regret that had weighed on him for so long. As he finished his tale, she reached out, her fingers intertwining with his. The touch sent a jolt through them both, igniting a flame that had long smoldered beneath the surface. "I understand," she said softly, her voice full of warmth, "and I forgive you." Their engagement, born from this moment of honest vulnerability, filled Barton Cottage with joy. Mrs. Dashwood and Marianne's excitement was palpable, their laughter and happy chatter echoing through the rooms. The very air seemed to shimmer with the promise of new beginnings. But beyond the walls of their happy home, storm clouds gathered. News of Edward's choice reached Mrs. Ferrars, and her fury erupted like a volcano. Her anger, hot and volatile, spewed forth, scorching all in its path. Yet like all tempests, it eventually subsided, redirected towards Robert and Lucy, whose actions she deemed far more reprehensible. As spring blossomed into summer, the winds of change continued to blow. Mrs. Ferrars, her anger cooling like embers, grudgingly gave her blessing. She settled £10,000 on Edward and Elinor, a peace offering that bridged the chasm between mother and son. In the midst of this whirlwind of change, another love story unfolded. Marianne, tempered by her experiences, found her gaze drawn more and more to Colonel Brandon. His steady presence was like a lighthouse in a storm, offering guidance and safety. She began to see him with new eyes, noticing the depth of feeling in his quiet glances, the tenderness in his gestures. His love, unlike the fleeting passion she had known with Willoughby, was a slow-burning flame, steady and enduring. One evening, as they walked together in the fading light, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Marianne realized that the flutter in her heart was not the wild, consuming fire she had once sought, but something deeper, more profound. It was a love that combined both sense and sensibility, a balance she had come to value above all else. Their courtship was a dance of gentle discoveries, each day revealing new facets of their compatibility. Colonel Brandon's patient devotion was finally rewarded, and Marianne found herself embracing a love that promised not just passion, but partnership. As autumn painted the countryside in hues of gold and crimson, an unexpected visitor arrived at Barton Cottage. Willoughby, his face a mask of regret, sought an audience with Elinor. In the fading light of day, he unburdened his soul, explaining the financial pressures and weakness of character that had driven his actions. Elinor listened with a mixture of pity and relief, recognizing this confession as the final chapter in a story that had caused so much pain. As Willoughby departed, she felt a sense of closure, like the turning of a page in life's grand narrative. The winds of change continued to blow, bringing with them the sweet scent of new beginnings. Elinor and Edward's wedding day dawned bright and clear, a perfect reflection of the joy that filled their hearts. They took up residence at Delaford Parsonage, their home a testament to the power of perseverance and true love. Not long after, Marianne and Colonel Brandon exchanged their vows, their union celebrated with as much fervor as that of Elinor and Edward. They settled into Delaford Manor, the grand house echoing with the promise of a future filled with love and understanding. As winter's chill gave way to the first tentative buds of spring, the Dashwood family found themselves transformed. The sisters, once divided by their approaches to life and love, now stood united in their newfound wisdom. They had weathered storms, both literal and metaphorical, emerging stronger and more resilient. In the quiet moments of their new lives, Elinor and Marianne often reflected on their journey. They had found the delicate balance between sense and sensibility, their experiences weaving a tapestry of understanding that would guide them through the years to come. The Dashwood family's fortunes, once so precarious, had been restored. But more than material comfort, they found true contentment in the love and support of their chosen partners. As they gathered around the hearth in their respective homes, the crackling fire casting a warm glow on their faces, they knew that they had found not just security, but happiness in its purest form. And so, as the seasons continued their eternal dance, the Dashwood sisters embarked on their new lives, wiser and happier for their experiences, surrounded by the warmth of true love and the promise of a bright future. The story of Elinor and Marianne, of sense and sensibility, had come full circle, leaving behind a legacy of love, growth, and the enduring power of family.
This book was generated using Speakter's AI voices. You can create human-like voiceovers in over 50 languages.